that really made socially necessary clear to me. It's not about any individual process, but the whole of society. There's that hole again.
There's that hole again.
There's that hole again.
Let's fucking do it.
Hello.
Hey.
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're two doomed extremists who are choosing to take the gun.
Fair enough. This go-round, we are starting the long journey of reading
Capital. Das Kapital.
Das Kapital.
A critique of political economy. It's about time we're reading Capital.
Yes. For this episode, we have read chapters 1 and 2 of Capital, the newest translation by the Pauls.
The Pauls, Paul Ryder and Paul North. They're actually Paul North. Is that none other than the Ohio State University?
Oh, no shit.
Yeah, no joke. It's interesting, the afterword here, William Clare Roberts, I had followed him on Twitter already. I didn't realize it was the same person until like last week. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Hold on here.
Yeah.
That's the same person.
That's fun.
So, nice stuff. It's a new translation, the first translation in fucking 50 years, basically, and it's been nice.
Yeah, Princeton University Press put it out, and it has one of the most handsome dust covers of any book I've ever seen.
Quite nice.
It's really going to look great on a bookshelf. But yes, let's go Bucks, I guess, for Paul North. We have read chapters 1 and 2 of Capital for this week's episode, and I suppose maybe we should talk about the way we're approaching reading Capital.
Yeah, our intention is to read Capital 1 in full. I don't know about volumes 2 and 3. We'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Yeah.
But we're going to read Capital Volume 1. Now, if you are just now thinking, Christ, I don't know if I can commit to reading every single week a different portion of Capital, don't worry. I think we are going to split it up every other week.
That is the intention, yes. I think it will, for both us and the listener, give us a little bit of a respite, because it's quite a book. We don't necessarily want to commit the next 20 episodes to just getting through Capital Volume 1. So we're going to, every other episode, read a couple more chapters so we can kind of check in on our reading with it while at the same time advancing our reading of theory and other work.
Yeah. I'm also in favor of that because, I believe in the spacing effect, right? I think that breaking things apart in time is a better way to crystallize the information in your brain. And on top of that, I think that interspersing some maybe different material in between may actually lead us to have some different reflections on Capital than if we were, reading it. Maybe in both directions, actually. Our reading of Capital will inflect upon our other choices of books, and those books will also change our opinion of Capital. So I'm interested to see how that works. Not that we have any specific books in mind, but just to let you, the reader, know, we're going to split it up, I think.
Yeah, and I agree absolutely. I think I'm not a true formalist in the sense that I think a text stands on its own outside of the context of when it was read, where it was written, how it was written, who wrote it, things like that. I think reading other stuff as we go through Capital will inform both our reading of Capital and the other stuff we are reading will be informed by Capital, just like you said. And I think that will make us all the better, more informed.
Sure. Well, I think that maybe that's the place that we want to start at is why read Capital?
Yes. Why read Capital, Will?
Why read Capital? Well, it's a great question, Will. Thanks for asking. Why read Capital is a great question. I think the biggest one is I'm trying to separate my motives in my mind because there's a couple of different motives that I have at least for wanting to read Capital. And the main one is probably demystification, if anything. I've said before, this book is held almost biblically, right?
Yeah.
In fact, Engels was very quick to say that Marx had written the Bible of the working class, which is a crazy thing to say, especially as a Marxist. I'm just going to be honest there. So I want to know what the fuck he was actually saying, right? And the best way to get that is to read it. That's that.
Agreed.
On top of that, we make a lot of assumptions about capitalism. And this is really demystification again, now that I'm starting to spell it out. But this is a demystification of Marx is number one. A demystification of capitalism is number two. We are well aware of the issues with capitalism. We're pretty well read in that regard already. But I think that this will provide maybe a more fundamental approach rather than a outside looking in approach, an insider's perspective. Maybe I'm more so referring to like the inner machinations. What about capitalism is really forcing people to make these choices that are creating the world that we live in today? right? We act as though these systemic structures influence people's choices in a way that they ultimately don't have control over, right? Or at least I think that that is influential in our thinking. So how did the structures of capitalism actually influence people in that regard? You know, how are the mechanisms and processes put in place by capitalism actually informing our reality? Something that Marx says very early on in the preface, I believe, is that a critique might be that we're splitting hairs. And the answer is, yeah, we are splitting hairs. It is, yeah. And as grueling as that might seem, especially in these first 3 chapters, well, that's what I've heard at least, is that the 3rd chapter is really the mark where afterwards it's plain sailing afterwards.
It seems that chapter 3 and chapter 2 are very closely linked.
Yeah, I'm a little...
So maybe it was a weird place to stop.
I was going to say, I'm a little bummed that we stopped there, but I think that in the first 3 chapters, at least from what I've heard, we've only read 1 and 2, is that they're building up a process which then will set the stage for what we're ultimately talking about.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard not to repeat myself a lot in this book, because something that Marx does a lot in this book is repeat himself constantly. Basically, he will say the same thing over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
You know,
as all good philosophers do.
Yes.
Yeah, I think my answer to why read Capital is more closely linked with your second motive, which is about breaking down our understanding of capitalism. I think as a language arts teacher, the reason I advocated people learning critical theory and using critical theory to examine fiction was because their lived experience gave them a certain perspective, but they didn't necessarily have a common language with which to analyze and discuss that lived experience. Literary theory gave us a common vernacular to apply our lived experience to the things we were reading. I think in the same sort of way, I want to read Capital because I understand through my lived experience the hellscape that capitalism has created. I would like to have a stronger understanding of the actual machinations happening, the actual gears turning, and have a common vernacular to discuss that with other folks to more firmly solidify my understanding of what I already, through experience, I think, understand to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I also think, maybe to expand on your point, like reading Capital and understanding why exactly capitalism leads to the things that it leads to helps us move past a simple reformatory attitude toward capitalism and helps us more firmly have a language and way of examining it and discussing it with others to help them recognize that reform is out of the question.
Right.
I think from a revolutionary theory perspective, we already have that. But there's, for me personally, absolutely no basis in the economic side to that attitude. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand economically how to explain that capitalism is beyond reform. I think there is a common attitude in the United States about like a benevolent benefactor or whatever, and if you just have enough, what's that guy's name, Dan Price or whatever, the like perfect millionaire, that capitalism can run smoothly, and that's bullshit, I think.
Right. Well, I think that this book, I'm hoping for this book to answer some very serious questions about our program ultimately. You know, a great example in my mind is that of a market. Is there a formulation for society that still involves a market for commodity exchange? My immediate reaction is no, you know, and I'm pretty confident that Marx is going to expand on that here. Maybe not in volume 1, I'm sorry to say.
Certainly not in the first 2 chapters.
Yeah, certainly not in the first 2 chapters, but I think that there are fundamental questions that need to be answered about if we're going to critique capitalism, right? What needs to be changed about it? I know that we talked about like, you know, smash the entire system and all that, but this is like a serious kind of strategy question, you know? Yeah. Just thinking about, we've had numerous conversations about China, right? That's what happened after Mao, is that Deng reinstituted market structures, right? He reinstituted some of the processes and forces of capitalism into China. And there are repercussions of that action, right? Mm-hmm. Something inherent to a market is inequality, you know? And if our ultimate goal is total equality, I know that that's not the exact word we're looking for, but you know, if that's our ultimate goal, then it's important to know that having a market in place is going to work against that goal, right? I'm not trying to link this book so much to my interest in modern China and socialism with Chinese characteristics, but I think that that's a serious question.
Yeah. I think in order to fully understand how to dismantle something, you need to understand how it works.
Sure.
If I were going to try to put it succinctly, that's a big part of my motive for reading Capital. And I will also, I think it's important to say at the beginning that if you, humble listener, are also new to reading Capital, I would caution you that this series will not be a primer on Capital.
No.
We are not experts on this text.
Absolutely not.
And I think the conversation will make that quite clear as we move into it. This is exactly like every other episode of this show has been. Two guys that read the text and are working through it ourselves, using this format as like a reading group for us to examine and work through it. We've made mistakes with texts in the past that we've already figured out. There are many that I'm sure we haven't figured out that we've made. And with something as technical as what's being presented in Capital, I'm certain that we're going to have similar misunderstandings or misappropriations or whatever. So just be forewarned.
Yeah.
If you have just read Capital chapters 1 and 2 and are like, I think I get it, but I would like to talk to somebody about it, that's more what this is going to be like.
Yeah, I agree. And this is where I'm actually going to move up our call to action right here. If you hear something that you disagree with, I want to hear it, right?
Yeah.
If you have a different interpretation of what we're saying, maybe you think we missed the mark, then email us, leftandredfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah.
I think that this series, especially our Marx Capital reading series, that will be more important than ever, especially if you consider yourself to be someone who is knowledgeable about Marx, right, and knowledgeable about capital.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side of that, I do want you to have some grace, right? We are going to make mistakes. That's a guarantee, okay? What I'm really hoping is that, this is an odd parallel, but I'm treating this like fucking phonics. I'm treating this like we're learning to read. We're literally learning the different sounds of the letters, and then when you put them together, you get a word that you then recognize, right? Oh, all of these processes are put together into one system that I am already familiar with. That's a weird example. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. It might not be completely clear right now, especially chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah.
But I do believe that ultimately reading this will be good.
Yeah, and that actually kind of brings up something that I was going to mention maybe at the end. Maybe part of the way that we're approaching reading this is going to open us up to discussing misinterpretations of the text before those get clarified later in the text. What I love about the way that this has been structured thus far is that Marx is very clearly well trained as a philosopher. He knows how to build an argument, and he does what good philosophers do. He lays out a thesis that you as a critical reader should have a question about that he then addresses.
Yeah.
That happened to me so many times reading even just these first 2 chapters, where it was like, but what about this? And then I read 2 paragraphs later and I'm like, oh, okay, he's addressed that. But reading it in the manner that we are, where we're going a couple of chapters at a time, we're going to have lingering questions like that aren't addressed until later chapters, maybe. And so it's going to be hard to parse out where we have a true misinterpretation of the text versus like, oh, we just haven't had that clarified in the text yet. So it's going to be kind of interesting.
Sure. Maybe we should do questions and predictions. What questions do you have? What do you think is coming next?
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know how well that would work, but I was going to mention that I think we are tentatively going to follow the schedule that David Harvey follows on his lecture series, right? That's kind of how I had it planned out. I know that there's some weird bits in chapters 16 through 23 there, which aren't exactly clear from the syllabus that I read, but we're really going to tackle a couple of chapters at a time, so
yeah,
you'll know. We'll tell you.
Yeah, big props to David Harvey at this point also, because we are, like you said, leaning in on his syllabus. And you've got the companion.
I have been reading and watching, and I also brought with me the companion by David Harvey from Verso, which really I just brought to be able to reference without having to do a lot of scrounging. So just know that sometimes I might say something poignant. I'll try to make it as clear as possible that might have come from David Harvey's lecture. I might be borrowing his words there, but just be forewarned that I at least am not simply reading Capital, but I also am trying to do this is the most academic reading that I have done yet for this project.
Hands down, this is the most academic thing we've read on the show.
I mean that I'm taking this the most academically, I mean, I am really like I'm locked in. I'm trying to make this happen.
Good.
I will understand Capital.
Okay, well,
Let's fucking break into it, man.
Chapter 1, the commodity.
Yeah, so he starts with the commodity because, as he says right off the cuff, The wealth of societies dominated by a capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. Everything around us is at least appearing to take the form of commodity production, right? That's the society we live in, is based around commodities, And I think that Marx is making a choice to start with the commodity just because it's something that's so apparent. Everybody knows what a commodity is. Everybody deals with buying commodities at the very least, if not selling. And so that's not a bad place to start.
No, not at all. I will say I think that this is kind of what I was taking from these first couple of chapters. We've already touched on things like this in previous episodes too, where I remember us having a conversation about labor and if animals labor or not.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, what we need is a definition of labor. And this is exactly the point. Like, I think we all in the modern world hear the word commodity and have an understanding of what we think that is.
Right.
But it is important for the building of a sound argument to have a definition of commodity from which everyone can work, on which everyone agrees. You know what I mean? And so I think like establishing what a commodity is makes a lot of sense at the onset because, like you said, he opens this chapter by saying, like, we recognize that the capitalist mode of production has a form of enormous accumulation of commodities. So what then, bears the question, is a commodity?
Right. Well,
I mean, he tells us, the next paragraph, a commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. So he's starting with a pretty broad definition there.
although I will say that, and I know that this is his motif here, but he just keeps adding on to that definition,
Yeah.
or maybe even subtracting from that definition. Even now, just at the start of this book, I already was like, a commodity has to be exchanged, right? Like, I'm already adding in those definitions that Marx brings to the table later.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. It's interesting.
Well, I would say I think that was my biggest difficulty with starting the text. And I alluded to this to you when we were texting about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think I already have a fundamental position. We are not in the abstract in the way that we truly need to be in order to understand the argument that he's building here. We exist in a world where commodities have existed. The exchange of commodities has existed for a very long time.
Yeah.
And so to extricate a commodity from our understanding of what it is and the way it operates, it's hard to do that truly.
Yeah.
Because like you said, we're already, when he defines commodity, we're like, well, what about this? What about that? That doesn't really factor in this, does it? But he will get to that.
Sure.
He does get to a lot of it, and I'm sure as we continue reading, he'll really get to it. But it is kind of hard at the beginning here to separate ourselves from what we think a commodity is versus what he's defining a commodity as.
Yeah, I think that definitely comes into play later as well. Like, I was thinking specifically when he talks about money, I'm sure Marx has a formulation of how fiat currency works, but clearly the monetary system we have today is so abstracted from gold as a standard.
Yeah, exactly.
How does that still fit within Marx's formulation of money as a universal general commodity? A commodity that reflects all of the values of all the other commodities around it. Does that still hold true when it's something that is ultimately made up, like how, we have it today? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. Yeah, so we're talking about the commodity, right? And he says that it has two values. There is a dual nature, right? So much of what Marx is constructing here has to do with taking a single object, splitting it into two parts, and then finding the commonality in that two parts and bringing it back together.
You might argue that it's almost dialectical.
Interesting. It is dialectical, obviously, but I think that it's an interesting structure for this kind of discussion because ultimately what he says is that what is the substance within those two values, use value and value, which...
Exchange value and use value.
Yeah, and I halted myself there because he even makes a technical distinction between value, the value form, and exchange value later on. So I'm really not trying to stumble over my own words here, but he's saying what is the actual substance within that value? Well, he says that it's labor, and he does so in an interesting way because if these two things can be exchanged equivalently, then that exchange necessitates a commonality between the two. In fact, somebody here has a little bit of redemption, and I think it might be Aristotle. If we can skip ahead to
the Aristotle shit, yeah.
On page 36, Aristotle very early on gets close to that equivalence. When he's talking about 5 beds equals 1 house, it's no different than 5 beds equals this or that amount of money. And so this isn't a new idea. This is something that's been thought of a lot. These two things have an equivalent, so there's an equivalent in between. It's the commutative property. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. right? Except in this case, we're looking at A and C and necessitating a B in the middle.
Yeah.
Sorry. Now, to expand on that Aristotle example, what's so interesting about it is that he says that the reason that Aristotle couldn't find that equivalence in labor is because Aristotle lived in a society where all labor wasn't equal. He lived in a society that had slavery. I don't know, I think that there's something really there. There's something interesting to think about there. Maybe that's why Aristotle couldn't see the equivalences because, he was thinking about slaves.
Yeah, well, Marx even says, Aristotle himself tells us what stymied his analysis, that he lacked a concept of value that comes from human labor. So maybe that is related to, the Greeks', let's say, copious use of slave labor. I don't want to get put the cart too far ahead of the horse here. Just to define the two terms, use value and exchange value, because they are exactly what they sound like.
Sure.
Use value is the value that a thing has to be used.
Mm-hmm. It satisfies your wants, right? Whether that's from your head or your
want
stomach.
or your need. Yeah. And use value is realized only when something is used or consumed. And then there's exchange value, which is exactly what it sounds like. How valuable is a thing to be traded for another thing? So something can have use value to you because you need it, but it also has exchange value if others need it. Mm-hmm. And there's almost a contradiction in those two things, that use value and exchange value both exist within one object, even though they can't really exist in one object.
Right. Well, yeah, it's even interesting because it's an abstraction, right? It's something that David Harvey says is that you couldn't cut open a commodity and see this half is the useful half, this half is the exchangeable half, right? Yeah. That value is one unit that can be realized as two different things. And again, I'm not trying to get too far ahead, but that realization is really the key here. It's not about the value or the exchange value or the use value. It's more so about the process of realization between the two. Later, when he talks about the equivalent form, I love the way he says that the use value of one commodity has to be equivocated by the exchange value of another. It has to be, not equivocated, it has to be represented.
Yeah.
You couldn't use a use value to represent a use value. A coat equals a coat. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It has to be expressed in another commodity, and the form of that expression is not the use of that commodity, it's the exchange. So the two different kinds of values are reflective of one another, but it's almost like you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Literally, I mean, something's use value as a piece of cake is to eat it, but if it has exchange value to be traded for something else, it no longer has the use value to be eaten. You can't have it and eat it too.
I love the example he gives of the house. Is that in my companion, actually? I think it might be shit. This is an example from David Harvey. You own a commodity called a house. Are you more interested in its use value or its exchange? You'll likely be interested in both, but there's a potential opposition here. If you want to realize the exchange value, you have to surrender the use value to something else, right?
Exactly.
The house is such an interesting example, though, because it's that kind of expansion of Marx's thought to the modern day, because something that David Harvey says that really spoke to me, he says, what happens to our social world when the house that was once conceptualized mainly in use value terms becomes reconceptualized as a way to build long-term savings, right? The initial object is not of a use, but instead of an exchange. How does that actually change the object itself? You're right, though, that it has to do with that contradiction between the two values.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it in a very simplified way, and I used the cake example before, but I was thinking of an apple.
Yeah.
An apple has use value to satisfy your hunger or, your sweet tooth or whatever. You eat the apple. But once you've eaten the apple, it no longer has exchange value. In depleting its use value, you've negated its exchange value. But if you trade your apple and use up its exchange value, you no longer have it to eat, so you've also negated its use value. You can't have both.
Right.
A house is an interesting one because, sounds like David Harvey is saying, while you're using it, you are building equity in theory, because it exists in a larger market. And I'm sure that we'll get in the weeds real deep on that.
Way later,
quickly.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, but so it is accumulating exchange value while being used. But the knowledge of that would also perhaps impact the way that you use the house.
Yeah.
You might redo your kitchen or something a particular way for resale value.
My friend, let me read. He says, does adding to the use value of the house for oneself add to the potential exchange value? A new modern kitchen? Probably yes. Some special construction to facilitate a hobby? Probably no. But it's an interesting example because, I think it gets back to Marx's abstraction, right? Marx is doing a lot of abstracted work here because it's the only way that we can really look at these systems and actually create any kind of logical construction of them. Yeah, if you look at the real world, like a house that you're living in, and then you're in your mind, you're accruing value that you will later exchange. Although that doesn't defeat our original purpose. The realization of the exchange necessitates that you are no longer using the house.
Yeah.
So, it's still in line. It's still in line. But the thing is that for the purposes of capital, we're abstracting that away, right? I'm not worried about the new kitchen. I'm not worried about, any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So I didn't mean to muddle us up there. I just thought
funny.
that the house was a really interesting example.
Yeah.
And this is a problem because I know that all of these connections are spun out later, and
Yeah.
I'm trying not to reach too far ahead because I know that there's stuff that comes before that. Yes. Anyway.
Yeah. But that's how he starts it, though. He defines a commodity, and then he tells us that a commodity has two forms of value, use value and exchange value.
Yes.
And then he continues to build his argument from there. Well, this is where he starts talking about labor, and this is where I think some real parsing might be useful, because he says on 16, if we set aside the use value belonging to the physical bodies of commodities, just one quality remains, that they are products of labor. So he says that even though a commodity has these two types of value, they are products of labor.
Right.
That value comes not from the commodity itself necessarily, but from the labor that produced the commodity. And then he gets into talking about labor power. And on the next page is where he mentions socially necessary labor. And that's a phrase that I think doesn't make a lot of sense immediately, or at least it didn't to me. Maybe you're more astute a reader than I, but I was like, well, what makes something socially necessary? Again, this is where it's hard to abstract it and separate it from what I know. Like, I'm thinking there are plenty of forms of labor that I think are necessary for a society to run.
Sure.
That's what I'm thinking of when I hear socially necessary labor. But I'm not sure that that's what he's getting at.
Yeah, in my mind, it's like, imagine society as a black box. If I put in X, what will I get out Y? That's not helpful at all. No, I'm thinking of a black box because it's like, there is a process happening in there. We're not making the distinction in the processes. We're just saying, this is the labor box. We put in these natural materials, out comes commodity.
Yeah.
We don't know what's happening in there because what's happening in there is all of society. We're not looking at any individual process at all. What is actually happening is the ability for society to utilize labor to transform those materials into commodities.
Yeah.
Right. And he says the same thing on 17. I love this example, which I've actually brought up before on the show. He says, we might be tempted to think that since the amount of labor expended to produce a commodity determines its value, the lazier or more incompetent the person producing it, the more valuable the commodity will be.
Yeah.
After all, he will take longer to produce it. That really made socially necessary clear to me. It's not about any individual process, but the whole of society. There's that hole again.
There's that hole again.
There's that hole again. Yeah.
Yeah, socially necessary labor time is the labor time needed to produce a given use value under a society's normal conditions of production, using labor that has an average level of skill and intensity.
Yes.
So just because it takes me 40 hours to build a table, if everyone else can do it in 30, I'm not getting 40 hours worth of quote, value out of my labor. The expectation, the socially necessary labor time would be 30 hours.
Yeah. And there's so many times in this book where I don't think it's like the way to think about it, but you can think about it like a businessman, It's not valuable for me to produce this commodity by hand because society can produce it in half as much time, Society can produce it in this much time with X, Y, or Z. It's like there are processes out there that are more effective for producing this commodity. We're not talking about my individual, unoptimal, inefficient process.
Yeah, I'm going to approach a lot of our reading about this through the lens of handicraft.
Sure.
Because it's something that I understand. And like your example is a good one. Building a guitar, for example. There have been luthiers that have built instruments for centuries that have handcrafted. The materials are hand-hewn, and then the instrument is built with tremendous care using only hand tools and the wits of the luthier. Mm-hmm. And you could get, with a skilled hand, a very useful, workable instrument at the end of the day. And the labor that went into that and the skill of the craftsperson was a part of the value of that instrument. As technology has increased, we can get the same level of playability from machines playability and repeatability of result from machines that cut the time necessary to build that tremendously.
Yeah.
And so, like, the value of the instrument at the end of the day is being represented. This is a question, I guess. Is the value of the instrument at the end of the day represented by the process building it or the quality of the commodity? Because there are still people that will pay thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars to have a luthier build an instrument by hand, even though it's arguable that the quality of that instrument is much different than the highest end machine-made instrument you're going to find. So, I don't know, that's just the sort of lens through which I'm examining what he's talking about here.
I know that this is going to come later in the book, but there is some controversy around the way that Marx specifies skilled labor, you know? I mean, we've seen it already in this section of the book because he says that skilled labor is simply like simple labor multiplied, right? And, you know, that abstraction is put in place for a reason, I'm sure, but it hasn't been entirely apparent yet. So I am genuinely interested to say what Marx has to say about skilled labor. You know, I don't know. Is it as simple as factoring in all of the training and education into the cost, so to speak, the labor costs? I mean, I don't know.
I don't know either. It will be an interesting development.
Yeah. Something funny that he says on page 18. By the way, Marx is funny. There's some really funny shit in here.
He is pretty funny in here, yeah.
If we could easily turn coal into diamonds, their value would drop below that of plain bricks, you know? This is 200 years ago, y'all. 200 years ago. Okay, so where were we? We were talking about the two forms of value, and those are crystallized labor, congealed labor, maybe, so to speak. So then, that labor, we've gone from two values to one labor, but now we're going to split that labor into two labors, right? There's a double character of labor.
Character of labor, and thus
represented in
begins
commodities.
The coat and linen.
Yes, the coat and the linen, man. I knew we were going to be talking about linen a lot in this podcast, but I didn't know it was going to be this kind of linen.
Yeah, wrong linen.
Sorry. Yeah, so coat and linen, right? It is now my goal to destroy society. Sorry, just as the use values, coat and linen, are qualitatively different, so too are forms of labor they owe to their existence, tailoring and weaving. If these things were not qualitatively different use values, and thus the products of qualitatively different forms of labor, they couldn't interact as commodities. A coat is not exchanged for an identical coat. A use value is not exchanged for the same use value. So the same thing we talked about before.
Yeah.
Now, to get to that double labor, that double character of labor.
Yeah, this double character of labor, he says that there's an instance of useful labor, purposeful, productive activity of a particular kind that turns linen into a coat. And he says this qualitative variety develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. Because linen and a coat require different forms of labor, like he says, tailoring and weaving. And we're talking about natural materials and labor. Use values such as coat and linen, in short, the physical bodies of commodities, combine those two elements. But as producers, human beings can, in a sense, operate only as nature does. All they can do is change the form of matter.
Yeah, that's something that he says on page 21 that I really enjoyed. You know, that's the pushback against the idea like labor is entitled to all it creates, is that labor isn't creating anything. It's just changing the natural forms. On page 21, I'm looking at labor isn't the lone source responsible for use values it produces or material wealth. It is their father, to speak with William Petty, and the earth is their mother.
Yeah.
You know, temper yourself. Temper yourself a little bit. It's we're just transforming the world around us, right? But the dual character really here is referring to the two kinds of labor, right? Concrete labor being what is actually the process going into producing the commodity, and then abstract labor, which is really that societal labor time, that socially necessary labor time, that's the representation of the exchange value within the product.
Yes.
Right?
I think so. Yes.
I think so.
Yeah.
So there is a distinction, right? And we're not necessarily worried about the concrete side of things, even though there is definitely a distinction between, say, weaving and tailoring. Ultimately, when we're talking about the labor that's embodying the value of those commodities, we're talking about, again, that societally necessary labor time.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at with that was the distinction between what he calls simple labor and complex labor. Weaving is simple labor, tailoring is complex labor, if I'm putting that together correctly.
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, yes, I agree with you, weaving, simple labor, tailoring, complex labor, but I don't know if that's the dual character that he's describing.
Okay.
I'm really not sure.
Well, because he says on 23, but the coat and the linen are not only values as such, they are values of a particular magnitude. According to our premise, one coat has twice as much value has 10 yards of linen. Where does the difference between their magnitude of value come from? From the circumstance that the linen contains half as much labor as the coat.
Right.
So, I don't know, he's getting at drawing this connection between the amount of socially necessary labor and the complexity of that labor and the value of the commodity that comes out of it. Because linen itself is a commodity that does take time, and
Right.
so there's value based on the amount of labor necessary to produce it, but it's the complexity of the labor necessary to produce it is lower. So the value of the linen as a quote-unquote raw material, even though it has been turned into linen, the complexity of that is lower. I don't know. I'm talking myself in circles.
No,
here,
I,
guess.
I see what you're saying. I think that example on 23 has to do more with the abstraction of labor. He's saying literally the circumstance that the linen contains half as much labor as the coat. The distinction between concrete and abstract is the difference between literal differences in forms of labor and just the idea of labor as a unit, right? In this case, we're talking about the labor power that goes into both the coat and the linen. We're not talking about the concrete processes, the weaving and the tailoring. And I don't think we're talking about the complexity of those processes either.
I guess I'm thinking of complexity meaning like there's labor necessary to create the linen, which is a necessary component of the coat. And so there is labor necessary to turn the linen into the coat.
Yeah.
So the amount of labor,
I see what you're saying. There's literally like
the labor becomes
it's like
more
a doubling. Like
Yeah.
there's labor in the linen, and then then additional labor is going into the coat.
yeah. Which is why, as a woodworker, for example, you can buy S4S material that's surface 4 sides, which means it's already been jointed and planed, so you have perfectly square 90-degree edges, and that costs you a lot more money than buying raw material that is not S4S or is even just skip planed.
Sure.
Because there's labor involved at the lumber mill between turning something from raw to S4S, and they just quote-unquote pass the cost of that labor onto you to buy it as S4S because you're paying for the additional labor necessary to turn it from a raw material into a more refined material.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
I don't know. Let's just keep
Yeah,
going.
yes. This is one of those things. Well, one more thing I'll say on it.
Okay.
I think that example is a great example of labor being the carrier of costs, the holder of value.
The source of value.
Yeah, exactly, right? That's a great example because that S4S lumber, that wood, whatever.
Yeah,
that S4S lumber has literally had more labor attached to it,
Yeah.
right? More labor has literally, in this case, been done to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rock and roll. Okay, great. Let's move on. The value form or exchange value. Right, so here's that distinction between the value form and exchange value I was talking about. I don't know, this whole section he starts to talk about the development of money by the equivalence of two commodities.
I will say this is the section where I was probably most confused, and I think I would most benefit from a reread because he starts giving us all of these different equations for the form of value, and then he talks about how each one is right and each one is wrong in a way that I was like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be taking from this.
Yeah. Oh, I love on page 25, he says, "Here, I want to do something bourgeois political economists have never even attempted."
Yeah.
So fucking funny. Lay bare its genesis, or in other words, trace the development of the value expression contained in the value relation. Ultimately, the whole enigma of money will also be solved. Simple task. No problem, Karl. I don't want to get too bogged down in the equations here, because I think what he's saying is really straightforward. It goes back to that equivalence that we were talking about earlier. One coat equals 20 yards of linen. Then, from that point, he expands it out. The simple individual value form. X of product A equals Y of product B. But that can be expanded because that equivalence has to do with labor, and labor is found in all commodities. So you can expand that value form to include other commodities, right? The expanded form, B, all he's saying is that instead of saying that X of a coat is worth Y of linen, that X of a coat could be worth Z of coal. We could slot many commodities into that, and then he's saying if we could do that, if we could have an or there, why not have and, why not put all of those together? That's really the only distinction between forms B and C, is that in form B, he's saying X of commodity A equals Y of commodity B, or of commodity C, or of commodity D, etc. The only difference in the general form is that he's taking all of those ors and putting them into one side of the equation. right? 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen. 10 pounds of tea equals 20 pounds of linen. Sorry, 20 yards of linen. 40 pounds of coffee, and so on. All of these things equal 20 yards of linen. And from that general form, we're then taking that one commodity, which has become an expression, a reflection of every other commodity's value, and we're attaching it to a societal commodity. That commodity is what becomes money.
Money, yeah.
Yeah. So that was a really complex way of just saying that money represents the value of all commodities. It's just that he's, instead of starting with the form of money, which he says is the mistake of many economists, he's instead starting at the other end of things.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, what I took from this section here is that there's a reciprocal relative value among commodities, meaning that there is a necessary social relation. Like you're saying, like 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, but if 1 coat also equals 5 pounds of coal, then 20 yards of linen also must equal 5 pounds of coal. So there's I would call that a transitive property.
Sure. I think that's right.
Is that correct? That's what I remember from geometry or whatever, fucking 20 years ago. But
dude, I do want to talk about the geometric example, because the first time I read this, I didn't have a fucking clue what he was saying, and this time I actually figured it out, and it's not anything crazy at all. You know, when he's talking about breaking down rectilinear figures into triangles, and then what he's doing with that example, I think, is way more impressive than I originally had thought, and it's only because I taught algebra that I have come to appreciate it. Not that I'm going to try to explain it here, But
yeah, so this whole bit, there's a relative value form that he's talking about among commodities, and then he will ultimately use that to move toward the ultimate adoption of a commodity that becomes an accepted standard from which we trade all other commodities against, and that is money.
There is something he says later on about the history of money, where he's saying that there's a shift in production. They're no longer producing commodities for their use, but instead they are being produced for the purposes of exchange. And I think that that is significant to a society's adoption of money as a standard.
Yeah, that's pretty late.
Yeah, it's actually in chapter 2. That's why we might want to come back to it.
Okay.
But there's something to that. It's a difference in the actual process, right? We're not making these commodities for the purposes of using them, for satisfying our wants, but commodities are instead being produced because we can realize then the use value of another object. You don't produce a commodity for your use, you produce it for a different use. You're just producing it for its exchange. What does that actually entail, though? I don't know.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. So I think Marx and I are on a first-name basis for this book, is what I've decided.
I've decided that now is the time I'm going to bring up a gripe with the way that this book is put together.
Hit me.
They have all of Marx's footnotes are listed on the page. When an editor puts a footnote in or an additional note, I have to flip to the fucking back and try to find it. I fucking hate that.
Yeah.
I know that it would make some of these pages have 2 lines of actual text and the rest of it all be footnotes. But put the fucking things that I'm supposed to reference on the same page.
You know, not that I need a third appendix or a third footnote section, but I really wish they would make a distinction between translation footnotes and not. Because so many times I've flipped to the back looking for more context and instead gotten, Marx uses the word value Schwart here, and it means value thing. And I'm like, okay,
cool,
awesome. You know, I spoke earlier, I'm really appreciative of the translation notes. I think that for the purposes of a new translation, I think that that's a kind of a critical thing, you know? If we're looking to get towards Marx's original meaning, then those kinds of notes are really nice to have.
Certainly, yeah.
But I'm not reading them right now, you know? That might be a second read thing for me.
Yeah.
But yes, I absolutely agree with you on that gripe.
We've jumped through like 20 pages here pretty quickly, but we're getting to the point where he starts introducing commodity fetishism. And I wonder if we should bring that up.
Yeah, I would love to, because I have an idea of what commodity fetishism is. This did not help me to clarify it necessarily. It's just, is it as simple as a society revolving around the relationship of things instead of the relations of people? Is that it?
Yes. Like, my understanding of it is that, you know, I think we hear the word fetish and we assume it to be a sexual thing. But
sure.
The root of where we see fetish as a sexual thing comes from what I know fetishism to be more about, which is around idolatry. And so, like, the commodity fetishism is, like a relation of the propping up of commodities over the propping up of people.
That's literally it, just the idolizing of commodities?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tell me if I'm wrong, left on red feedback. @gmail.com.
Yes, leftonrightfeedback@gmail.com. If you have a nicer definition of commodity fetishism, or if we are right, just tell us. But yeah, okay.
Because on 49 is where he introduces it. He says, I call this fetishism. Labor products become fetishes the moment they are produced as commodities, and this fetishism is thus inseparable from commodity production. So he's saying it's inherent in the production of commodities for there to be a fetishization of commodities. Once they are produced, that fetishization exists.
I think there's an important addendum here, and it's that our definition of commodity has changed already.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's not that we're talking about commodities as in something that satisfies our wants, but now we're talking about the commodity that is made for exchange, for the realization of a different want.
Yeah, and he says, this is at the bottom of 49, and I kind of numbered this because it kind of builds. He says, useful objects can become commodities only because they are made by instances of private labor carried out independently of one another. Then, the aggregation of these instances constitutes a social totality of labor. Then, the specific social characteristics of their instances of private labor first appear within an exchange transaction. And lastly, thus, to the producers, the social relations of their instances of private labor appear not as direct social relations in which human beings are connected by their work, but as what is in fact the case here. Things mediate the relations among people, while there are social relations among things. That's the fetishism that he's getting at. That we have switched from relations between people and turned to relations among things.
Yeah. Things mediate the relations among people. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the society we're living in, man.
Yeah. Side note, the footnote on 48 references this concept of table shaking. Did you read this footnote? Have you ever heard table shaking before?
No.
Me either. It seems like one of those things that, like, if you're reading a particular text like this, that comes from a particular time and context, if I didn't have this footnote, I wouldn't know what the reference was. And the footnote doesn't even make it particularly clear to me. But it's like one of those things that I feel like that's where you can lose a lot of understanding of a text without recognizing its reference. Because I didn't, and I was like, I've never fucking heard that before.
Yeah, no, I certainly didn't know what they were talking about. In fact, I highlighted a bit of that portion on the table because it was funny to me, but I couldn't make the connection to what he was actually saying about commodity fetishism there. When he's talking about tables, he's just saying anyone can see human activity modifies natural materials. Okay, great. Of course, the table isn't less made up of wood. Wonderful. But the moment the table... Okay. It's that the actual physical aspect of the table... I just was having a hard time putting this together. It's that the physical aspect of the table is lost in the commodity exchange. It's not important what the physical aspects of the table actually are. Yeah, I'm just looking at when he says, the moment the table begins to act as a commodity, it metamorphoses into a sensuous, super sensuous thing. Yeah. And that's because the commodity is sensuous as in it's made of physical material, and it's super sensuous because its physical aspects don't matter because its commodity exchange is based on gelatinous human labor.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. But I just love it turns upside down and spins bizarre notions out of its blocky head. A performance far more fantastic than if it were to start dancing on its own accord.
Yeah. I bet that was a fucking knee slapper in 1856 or whatever.
Well, it is funny. That's the thing, is that it is funny. There is something funny about sensuous super sensuousness, you know? There's something odd in that contradiction. It's got to do with that fucking dialectical process, and I don't see the end of it yet.
He does have a turn of phrase that it can often be quite funny, and other times can leave me baffled, and I read a sentence 5 times and I feel like I get less of a sense of it every single time.
Yeah.
Like there's one on top of 49. And so the commodity form also reflects back at the people, the producer's relation to the totality of labor as a social relation among objects that exist apart from and outside the producers themselves. I had to read that so many fucking times to even start to put it together. It can get a little, I can get a little lost in it sometimes.
Yeah. Not that maybe this is showing my hand too much, but I'm really hoping that after chapter 3, it becomes much more straightforward.
Yeah, it's no secret that I prefer the more revolutionary stuff that we're reading.
Yeah.
I like something that's got a little bit of a fire in its veins, you know, and this chapter 1 certainly isn't it.
Oh, yeah.
But nonetheless,
this
is where he does start talking about stuff that's made for the purpose of exchange on the top of 50.
Yeah.
This division of the labor product into a useful thing and a value thing isn't truly activated until the exchange has proliferated enough for useful things to be made for the purpose of exchange, and thus their value character comes into consideration as far back as when they are produced. So this is a question that I had very early on when I started the text, was like, well, when I think of a commodity, again, this is me coming at it from the context in which I live, I don't think of a commodity as necessarily having use value. When I hear the word commodity, I'm immediately thinking of its exchange value.
Sure.
Because I'm thinking about a commodity as not something that satisfies a need, but something that satisfies a want. And so I'm thinking of it as something that is produced merely to be exchanged. And I was really interested when I got to this part of the text where he starts talking about stuff that is made for the purpose of exchange.
Yes.
Because I don't want, again, not to get too far ahead, but even in chapter 2 where he starts talking about other communal societies in history,
Right.
and how things that were once made purely for use value turned into things that have exchange value to be traded across tribes or borders or whatever,
Yeah.
it changes the character of that commodity then
Yeah.
very considerably.
That was really interesting to me, that part in section 2.
Yeah. And so I don't know what my comment is exactly, other than that was one of those examples where the whole time I'm reading up to this point, I'm like, yeah, but not everything is made to be used by the maker.
Sure. He does kind of cover his ass. He says that something can be a product of labor and useful and not be a commodity. He says that he gives a couple of examples like that I thought were interesting.
On page 50, he talks a little bit around that. Different instances of labor can become fully equal only when their real non-equality is abstracted away, only when they are reduced to the common character they have as an expenditure of human labor power, abstract human labor, and the socially useful character of the producer's labor is thus reflected in the form that their labor products must be useful to others. It's interesting that, I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting that line, but that bit, it's interesting. This distinction of use value and exchange value, and this knowledge of this third thing, abstracted human labor, that is creating that value. Labor is necessary to create both forms of value. The exchange value for one is the use value for another.
Yes.
Labor is a necessary component of both of those forms of value. Okay, I know that a table is a useful thing,
Right.
but I don't have need of a table. But I know I can use my labor power to build a table that will have exchange value for me that is a use value for another person. It's just, there's something really intriguing about the dialectical contradictory nature of that,
Yeah.
to me, that I don't know how to put into words exactly.
I gotcha. I love
Real strength of a podcast. I
Dude.
can't articulate my thoughts.
I just think that it's reflective of fucking capital more than anything, you know? I don't think it's... Yeah. I mean, I know that it's going to become more apparent the more we read.
Yeah.
You know? That's the problem here, is that I felt a little lost reading some of this. I don't know.
No, I did too.
Yeah.
I did too, for sure.
Yeah. I love at the bottom of page 50. When people exchange their different kinds of products, they equate them as values. And when they do that, they equate their diverse instances of labor as human labor. So that's that abstraction of labor. They know not what they do. Value, then, doesn't come with its name written on its forehead. It instead transforms every labor product into a social hieroglyphic. Later on, people try to decipher the meaning of this hieroglyphic to solve the mystery of their own social product. For a useful object's characteristic of being a value is a social product every bit as much as language is.
He does, right after that, get into this interesting example. He uses air, and he talks, I think this is where he talks about the chemist also, that the specific social character of independent instances of private labor consists in their equality as human labor, and that this specific social character takes on the form of labor products' value character, are points valid for only one particular form of production, namely commodity production. Yet to those caught up in the relations of commodity production, these points have seemed as definitively valid after the above-mentioned discovery as they did before it, or just as much as the fact that after scientists broke air down into its component parts, the air form, in the sense of the physical form of the thing air, remain on... Nah, fuck it. Never mind. Cut all that.
Dude, that's what I'm saying. It's like, I know what he's saying here. Like, this example about air is the same as the example about the fucking triangles. You know? He's saying that the physical components are not necessarily what is reflective of the value. In the triangles, he was saying that the area coming from the length and the height... See, I said I wasn't going to try to explain this, and then I started trying to explain it. Yeah.
It must be in the second chapter. There's that bit where he's talking about chemists breaking something down.
Yeah, where he's talking about he's talking about the acids, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's way earlier. where he
is
says
it? Okay.
propylformate. It's yeah.
It doesn't.
Right here.
It doesn't.
It's on page
All right.
27.
Okay.
That was an interesting example. Fuck, I was about to do the same thing. It's an interesting example because he's saying that these two things have the same atomic structure, the same proportion, C4H8O2, except they are completely different things, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although a chemist would probably argue with this example because they have different bonds. They have different structures. I looked up these two things. They just have different structures. It's not that crazy.
That's fun that you looked them up.
I needed to know, okay? I had read that fucking example about the triangle so many fucking times that I just finally had to draw it out and realize what he's saying. And I will explain it now. What he's saying is that, first off, fuck the modern education system, okay? Just to break from capital for a second. Fuck the modern education system.
Here, here.
Because nobody fucking tells you where anything comes from, especially in math. Math is a fucking mystical black box formula bullshit the way we teach our kids. It's ridiculous, okay? The simplest accepted area formulation for a triangle, 1/2 of the base times the height. Everybody can, yeah. Oh, whoop-de-doo.
I
Where does it
remembered.
come from?
I don't know.
Exactly. The answer is really simple. Okay? To formulate the area of a triangle, they simply reflect it and make it a square. Then you take the area of the square and cut it in half diagonally. Thus, that gives you the area of the
1/2 the
triangle.
base.
Oh my God. It's so simple. Why couldn't a math teacher tell me that?
Yeah.
You know, that's it. What Marx is using that example for, though, is to say that the physical attributes of the triangle, the base and the height, are not directly constructive of the area, right? We have to abstract it out to a full square and then cut it in half, even though that is the simplest formula for area, right? The physical attributes of the product are not necessarily inherent in the value in the same way. That's all the triangle example meant. And when I finally fucking realized that, and then also realized that I had been done dirty by every fucking math teacher in my education, it was like a light bulb moment, man.
Yeah.
You know? Whew. Yes. I think that he's saying the same thing here about air, right? The physical components of air do not change our usefulness of air. We're going to breathe it whether we know it's made up of oxygen and nitrogen or not.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yes.
There we go. Thank you. The Robinson Crusoe example was really interesting to me on 52.
It feels like he's teasing.
Oh,
He's
he
like,
definitely is.
It's so good.
And I don't know who Max Worth is, but I'm sorry. You got burned.
You got clowned on. You got clowned on.
Yeah, you got clowned hard. But the Caruso example was interesting to me because I think it's a natural inclination when you start talking about things like commodities and markets and stuff like that to just extract it from what we know as our current context and then just separate it and say, like, if we were on a desert island and none of that stuff existed, how would it operate? And that's where the Robinson Crusoe example comes in, and I think that that's pretty fun. Though undemanding by nature, he still has wants and needs of different kinds to satisfy, and so he has to perform different kinds of useful labor. Making tools, building furniture, taming llamas, fishing, hunting, and so on. We'll leave out prayer and things like that because our Robinson enjoys them and sees such activities as recreation, not labor. Which was one of those times where I read that sentence and I had a question, a thought, where I was like, what's the difference between recreation and labor? What if one's recreation produces use value for another person? This is a question I had as I was reading it.
That's a great question, in fact.
But he goes on to say that necessity forces Robinson Crusoe to divide his time carefully among his different tasks, and the relations between Robinson and the things that he makes up his self-created wealth are so simple and transparent that even Mr. Max Worth could understand them without overtaxing his brain. Okay.
God damn.
But it's a really good example.
Yeah.
Because I think that maybe I'm just editorializing, but like my thought when I'm trying to simplify things like commodities and markets and exchange is to separate it from how complex the system is now and say like, okay, I'm on a desert island. How am I doing this? What am I doing? What am I looking for? I think it's a really good example, and I like that he gets the burn in there at the end.
I think it even goes back to our earlier points about simple versus complex, maybe concrete versus abstract. Regardless of the complexity of these activities, what he's saying is that they're merely different modes of human labor, right?
Yeah.
It's just that labor must be expended. The actual process of what Robinson Crusoe is doing doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, he's just expending his labor. And the example of one man on an island, one man whose labor we can completely account for, I think is really effective for making that point.
Yeah, that's true. This might be a side note, a tangent or whatever, but I think that simplifies a conversation around the way we value labor today and why people believe that laborers don't deserve a living wage for the labor that they extend because they have some sort of superiority complex against the type of labor they do versus the labor that people whom they're denying a living wage expend, even though it's all fucking labor and it's all necessary.
It's like a prideful sunk cost thing, man. It's like I've invested, note the financial term, I've invested time into building these skills, and thus that is worth more because it literally incorporates more time, right? That's an extension of that same conversation we were saying earlier. Is complex labor just a multiplication of, is the labor put into the earlier education a factor in the cost? I'm sure we'll come back to that whenever Marx decides to elaborate on complex and simple labor.
Yeah. That is, again, another thing, another lens that I'm reading this through. I've been, for whatever reason, thinking a lot about the social relations of labor lately because, I think a lot of folks have a tendency to think that they just want to exercise themselves from a situation. It's like, I'll just buy fucking 50 acres out in the middle of nowhere and I'll live off the grid. I'll do all this sort of shit. But that is discounting the fact that so many of the things necessary for an individual to do that rely socially on the labor of others. Even if you are growing your own food, if you've built a solar grid or whatever, and you're generating your own electricity, all of that sort of shit, all of that is still dependent on labor of others. And to deny that is foolhardy. It's faulty. And that is maybe another manifestation of the same sort of logic around, quote, skilled and unskilled labor. All labor is skilled.
Yeah, skilled and unskilled is a better way. I was forgetting those terms. Sorry, go ahead.
No, but it's just a lot of the way I'm interpreting the text is through these thoughts that I've been having about that lately.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a bit of a parallel between what Marx even says next when he talks about medieval Europe. And he's talking about
indentured labor?
Yeah, I'm really just thinking about this line here. Personal dependence characterizes the social relations of material production, as it does the spheres of life based on this form of production. Precisely because personal relations of dependence constitute the existing social foundation, labor and its products have no need to take on fantastic forms and odds. So, okay, that's getting away from it a little bit there, but it's the idea that there is a dependence on a social relation. We can't escape that no matter how much you try. And we've said this before, but to remove yourself from the situation means you've just accumulated the wealth already. You're not producing anything for yourself on this fucking stretch of land. You're simply taking with you the products of other people's labor already.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So, I love that point there.
Oh, he even kind of gives an example like that on the next page. I called it the homesteader's example, but he's talking about it as a patriarchal rural industry of a peasant family that produces all of this stuff to satisfy its own wants and needs. Same sort of thing.
Sure.
On 59, he gives this if commodities could talk thing.
Yeah.
If commodities could talk, they would say, although our use value may interest people, it doesn't belong to us as things. What does belong to us as things is our value. How we interact as commodity things proves that this is so. We relate to one another only as exchange values, which is just a silly thing to set up. One, that if commodities could talk, and two, that they're so self-aware. But what is funny to me is that he comes back to that pearl or diamond example because he says value is a property of things, riches of man. Value in this sense necessarily implies exchanges. Riches do not. Riches are an attribute of man. Value is an attribute of commodities. A man or a community is rich. A pearl or a diamond is valuable. A pearl or a diamond has value as a pearl or a diamond. No chemist has ever studied a pearl or a diamond and found exchange value there. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier when I was trying to find this chemist example, because it's about the social relation. That is not inherent to the commodity. The idea of that value is not inherent to commodity. It is a social thing. It kind of clicked for me there.
No, I love that no chemist has ever studied a pearl or diamond and found exchange value. Very good.
Yeah, but that's the end of chapter 1.
Yeah, cool. So, the commodity. Do we have a firmer understanding of it?
Firmer,
sure. But, maybe in so much as quicksand is firmer than water, I'm still drowning at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think my big takeaway is that I have an understanding of what he's set up as a commodity having a dual nature of value. Yes. It has use value and exchange value, and those things cannot exist simultaneously for the same person.
Right.
And then he's getting to the social relations of the exchange of commodities and how labor plays into that. I think
Yes.
those are my big picture zoomed out takeaways from chapter 1.
Yeah, definitely. Getting myself into a dialectical thought process, I think, is already a huge part of this chapter. And it has to do with those two things. I'm thinking about that structure, just, out into
Yeah.
two, back into one, just expanding and contracting.
Yeah.
How dialectical. So, yes, chapter 2,
Chapter 2, the exchange process.
the exchange process. Yes. What do I have to say about this chapter? He talks about the origins of money. There's something interesting there. Something that David Harvey says that I really appreciate is that Marx is not necessarily making a historical argument here about money. It's not that he's saying this is how money developed throughout history from the beginning of society. Instead, what David Harvey says is that he's making a logical argument. He's saying that if we have a societal relationship of commodity exchange, then that necessitates a commodity in between that acts as money. Right? He's not saying that money had to come out of history because of this or that. Different forms of currency have existed throughout history in a million different forms. In fact, something that Marx says towards the bottom of 34, he even says that the political economist with his crude bourgeois way of seeing things fails to notice until he encounters its fully developed, that is money. Then, in an attempt to explain away the mystical character, he puts less dazzling commodities in their place and recites with undying pleasure the whole list of plain commodities that have played the role of commodity equivalent in their day, right? It's not about the history of things. It's not important. I don't care that this or that tribe used giant rolling stones to mark their debts. Cool. Right? That's not the point. Mm-hmm. What Marx is saying is that this structure of commodity exchange then necessitates money as a creation, as an expansion, a completion almost of the general equivalent form. Right? That's where he's saying that money comes from. And it's not necessarily a historical argument. So I just wanted to put that out there because I just get the feeling that that's like the dumb anti-communist brain thing is like, well, actually money existed for millions of years. You know, it's like, how can you be against capital when we've actually been bartering with seashells for, I don't care. That's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that feels like a conflation of commerce and capitalism. Obviously, it's not the same thing.
But that's that kind of demystification that I'm getting from this book.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, chapter 2, I don't know what to say about it other than I just have a collection of comments more than
much the same.
Particularly well argued. I will say one thing that jumped out to me on the first page is the footnote about Proudhon, where he kind of takes down Proudhon in this footnote, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah. I don't have anything to say about it. I've not read any Proudhon, so I can't say, but it seems quite clear that he's being very critical. It's hard for me to understand from which edition all of these footnotes come. Sometimes it's marked and sometimes it's not. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. Maybe I would have a clearer conception of that if I'd read the editor's introduction or whatever. But
you should. Reader, you should too. Don't skip the editor's introduction. I'm not shaming you.
No, it's fine. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know anything about Proudhon, really, so...
Something I got from a footnote here, I don't know where it is, but dictatorship of the proletariat was invented by Blanqui. It was coined by Blanqui. I didn't know that.
I didn't either.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Anyway.
On the first page, the thing that did actually really jump out to me, though, is literally at the very end of the page. He says, the economic relation determines the content of the juridical relation or the relation of wills. Here, people exist for one another merely as representatives of commodities.
Yeah.
Which is that fetishism again, but really fucking sad.
I mean, it's like, what is your purpose in life? It's not to fish. It's not, I'm just thinking about, this requires some stupid groundwork, but there's a meme that's like, if you work a job that can't be explained in 3 words, it's not a real job. I catch fish. I build tables, right? I teach kids, those kinds of things. And, when I saw it initially, I was like, okay, I see what you're saying, whatever. But it speaks to me in this way, that you're defining yourself by your production. There's so much more that goes into a person than just what they're producing with their labor. It seems sad. It seems painful. I don't know.
Yeah, it's related to that thing I think I've mentioned before, where so much of our identity gets wrapped up in the work we do.
Yeah.
In a very toxic way. And I think that that's one of the ways so many workers get exploited. Being 2 former teachers in the room, that's exactly the way it is. Many people go into teaching with good intention, with the intent to help, to serve their community, to offer something of value to others. And that sense of service becomes a part of their identity. The only way teachers can continue to be treated the way they are is through the exploitation of that desire
Yes.
that teachers have. And it becomes so wrapped up in their identity that it's hard to walk away from. It's so fucking toxic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The continued miserable existence of education is predicated on the exploitation of that identity.
Exactly.
You know, it's predicated on the exploitation of the goodwill of people.
Yes.
You know, I absolutely agree. So, man, shed a tear.
Yeah.
So he talks a little bit about...
It's really all about how commodities are exchanged.
Yes.
That's literally the name of the chapter, the exchange process, and it's about how one individual exchanges their commodities to another individual. And this was another moment where I had a question that I asked as I was reading. I read the sentence and was like, well, what about this? And then he actually does address this on the same page.
Okay.
So if we go to 63,
All right.
he's talking about the direct exchange of products. And he says, things A and B aren't commodities before they are exchanged. Only through exchange do they become commodities.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I'm not sure. Something created to be exchanged isn't a commodity, question mark? Like we were saying before, I have a table. I have no need for a table, but I know there's exchange value in building a table. So even though it has no use value to me, I might produce it as a commodity, recognizing that it has exchange value, right?
Okay.
So that was my question. Can't something be created as a commodity even before it is exchanged? And he continues on farther down the page. He says, commodity exchange begins where such communities end, at points of contact with foreign communities or their members. But as soon as things have become commodities for the outside world, they turn into commodities inside a community as well, due to a rebound effect. And people gradually come to rely on use objects produced by others. Constant repetition makes exchange into a normal social process. So he's addressing that here, that exchange becomes their purpose, but that gets socialized to a point where it's normalized as a part of our expectation of what a commodity is.
Yeah. This goes back to that logical argument that I was talking about, is that he's saying that there is a hardening of the distinction between the usefulness things have for meeting immediate wants and needs and their usefulness for exchange. From that moment on, the use value of things splits off from their exchange value, while the ratios at which things are exchanged now start to depend on how they are produced.
Yeah.
That's when it is boiling back down to that socially necessary labor time.
Yep.
What did I write here? How well does this hold up? Yeah.
Well, and that's the same sort of thing that I was kind of alluding to earlier, like when I was talking about we're always reliant on the labor of others, whether, like you said, it's been accumulated already or if we're continuing to rely on it.
Yeah.
Like, you don't make the tires for the vehicle that you drove to your fucking compound in the middle of Montana. You didn't code the computer OS that you're using to do all your, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you probably didn't even clear the land, you know?
Exactly. Shit. We're always reliant on the labor of others. There's always a social component that is necessary, a socially necessary component to others' labor, the labor of others. The important part is, where is the exploitation of that labor taking place?
I couldn't stop thinking, we live in a society.
Exactly.
We truly live in a society.
Anyway.
Yes. Yeah. So finally, he talks about the development of the money form, right? So as commodity exchange developed, the general equivalent form becomes firmly attached only to certain kinds of commodities, and thus it crystallizes into the money form. This was a cool point. The money form becomes attached either to the most important exchange articles from outside the community, which are in fact spontaneously arising forms of appearance, or else the main use object constituting part of a community's property that can be disposed of, right? So it's either something that is not necessary and spontaneous that can be then applied as value. That's something I think of as like seashells, like bead jewelry. That's the kind of thing in which a lot of historical examples of money come into my mind. But then, he also says, for example, nomadic people were the first to develop the money form because all their possessions were portable, right? In that case, he's thinking about something like cattle.
Yeah.
In that case, it's almost kind of the opposite side of the spectrum where it is like something that is hugely important, so much so that it kind of occupies the space of money maybe by default.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. It's an interesting thing because in the modern world, and he'll go on to argue, or at least begin to argue, which I think he develops probably further in the third chapter, that money is a commodity in and of itself.
He mentions it here.
Yeah, but the usefulness of money as a commodity outside of its exchange value as a commodity is mostly null. it's paper.
Yeah.
There is something potentially useful in that, but you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have a particular use value in and of itself.
I'm just thinking about the classic example with the German hyperinflation when they were like fucking doing wallpaper with the Deutschmarks and all
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like it could be something arbitrary, not to belittle it or something
Sure.
like that, but something that doesn't inherently have a great use value, or something that has a tremendous use value and its exchange value is reflective of that use value, like
Yeah.
cattle.
Yeah. I think that was a fantastic example. Great job,
Yeah.
Carl.
Well done.
Well done. Yeah, he does do some work to talk about why we use metal ultimately.
Yeah.
You know, the points he makes is that it has to be capable of expressing purely quantitative differences. It has to have the same kind of purity. It has to be able to be recombined and divided. So metal is a natural response there.
I lulled, literally, at him citing himself at the start of that, by the way. Just a fucking ridiculous move.
So good. So good. Yeah, very nice. The exchange process gives the commodity it transforms into money not its value, but its specific value form. There's some bits here about how, gold, the value of gold and silver is imaginary. That's a misleading thing to think.
And I read the footnote on that because it seemed like he was sending shots, and he does seem specifically to be sending shots at thinkers like Locke, who argue that. And I was a little taken aback at first because I'm sure I've said something very similar, and I do think, like,
As have I.
we attribute value to money. It doesn't have a lot of inherent value in and of itself.
Sure.
But because we have socially accepted its value, we all carry on as though it is valuable. And that's what I was thinking when he was talking about the imaginary value.
Yeah, I also felt hit a little bit at first because I was thinking about all the times I'm like, economics is fake, money is made up. But he's just saying the way that it carries value is different than how we might imagine,
Yeah, I appreciate that he challenges that thought that I had by suggesting that if you think that way, then logically every commodity is ultimately a symbol and doesn't have any real value in
Right.
and of itself.
Yeah.
Well, really, the only thing that I have remaining here comes from page 67, and this is a question that remains unanswered to me. So when he's talking about gold, in that first full paragraph there, the second line, knowing that gold is money and therefore directly exchangeable with every other commodity doesn't mean we know, for example, how much 10 pounds of gold is worth. Like all commodities, money has to express its magnitude of value relatively through other commodities. Its own value is determined by the labor time needed to produce it, blah, 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 blah. And while I agree with everything that he says there, my immediate thought was around scarcity.
Yeah.
Like, isn't part of the reason gold is valued at the level that it is because of the scarcity and difficulty with supplying it? Like, I get it. Without a relation among commodities, you don't know what 10 pounds of gold is worth. In the same way, you don't know what 10 pounds of dirt is worth. But dirt is much more plentiful. Doesn't scarcity still play a role in the valuation of a commodity? It's not just about it being expressed through every other commodity that contains the same amount of coagulated labor time or whatever. That's a question that still is lingering for me. What am I misunderstanding to not?
I don't think you're
acknowledge scarcity?
misunderstanding it. I think that it's a timely difference. I think that gold as an initial commodity does contain value as in it's an abstraction of labor, right? Like you're saying, it contains all the labor that is required to take it out of the earth. That's what makes it so valuable initially.
To mine it, yeah.
Right. The difference is that now that it has become societally accepted as the reflection, it's that movement from the general form of the commodity to the money form. The initial value of gold was set by its labor. It's just that now that we have, as a societal process, decided to reflect every other value of commodity onto that gold,
Relative to it.
It's not that value still doesn't contain the value of the labor in the commodity of gold itself. It's just that the way that we are utilizing that commodity, is now a societal process. It's a full reflection of every other commodity in society. I don't think that they're necessarily as disparate as you might be thinking.
I'm not even necessarily saying that I think that they're disparate. I just think scarcity still has to play a role that I feel like he hasn't addressed. I mean, to use another lumber example, ash.
Sure.
The ash tree. There is the England ash borer has been around for about 2 decades at this point and has been decimating, which means turning down by a magnitude of 10. Maybe I shouldn't say decimate because it's not. I don't know that it's by 10. But anyway, has been
Okay, Carl.
obliterating
Yes.
the ash trees on the East Coast where they are most prevalent here in North America and the United States. But what that has meant in the last 10 years is that there is an oversupply of ash because people's trees are getting cut down. So those trees are going through urban mills and different things like that. There's a lot more ash available. So 3 years ago, I could buy 8-quarter ash. Here's one for all my lumber nerds. I could buy 8-quarter ash for less than $3 a board foot.
Yes.
But because there is a scarcity of supply, there was an overabundance previously because all of these trees were being cut down. But they're no longer surviving because of the ash borer. So there are fewer and fewer of them remaining. And so now that that oversupply has been dwindled, we have not enough ash trees left. So the demand is exceeding the supply.
Yeah.
So now 8-quarter ash costs me over $6 a board foot. So it's doubled in price because of its scarcity. The labor necessary to produce the lumber that I'm buying is the same, but the commodity itself has become more scarce, thus increasing its value.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I don't know. I think that kind of scarcity is still reflected within it. I'm thinking of two different ways of tackling this. In Spain's colonial period, they exported so much gold and silver from South America that it blasted their economy to bits.
Yeah.
Okay, so certainly the supply of gold is a factor here. The other way of thinking about it is much more modern because we still do the same thing. Even with our completely abstracted fiat currency, we still have a tight control of the money supply, right? That's what monetary policy is all about. It's about controlling the literal supply of money to affect the population in this or that way. So I think that it is absolutely still a factor, even in the modern day. I just think that, I don't know, I think it's factored in. That's what I think. I hear your point, and I think it is valid, but I hope maybe we'll get some elaboration on that.
I've referenced the Rip Van Winkle caper, the Twilight Zone episode on this show before, but literally the premise is they steal a bunch of gold, and then they go to sleep for 50 years, and they wake up and find that gold is now so plentiful that the heist, everything that they'd stolen, is basically worthless.
Sure.
Because it is no longer scarce.
I mean,
and if I'm looking to anyone for economic policy, it is the great Rod Serling. So, I don't know. Just scarcity, I feel like that's something that still needs to be addressed for me in my reading of this.
Well, perhaps this is maybe creative license, but maybe the shift that I don't know enough about economics to really say this definitively, but maybe that's a factor in our choice to move away from the gold standard, I mean, obviously I think it is, but I think it is a factor.
Fair enough.
It is a factor. There is one more thing I had on 68. I really love how he ends this chapter. Emerging from the earth's bowels, these things, gold and silver, incarnate at once and directly all human labor. Hence the magic of money. Human beings now behave in a purely atomistic way in their social production process, and their own relations of productions have a thingly form independent of their control and conscious individual action. These circumstances, the former and thus also the latter, first appear through the fact that labor products generally take on the commodity form. The enigma of money fetish, then, is merely the enigma of the commodity fetish, now in the form in which we can see it well enough to be blinded by it. Just a fantastic quote, but I think that moment is when I was able to really say, what was the point of these two chapters? To what are we learning about commodities for? What is the actual reason? It is for this reason, because our society is structured around the exchange of commodities, and thus it was important to learn about commodities.
Yep.
So I think just a really banger way to end that chapter, and that's chapters 1 and 2.
We did it.
Woo! All right.
It's the cavalcade of quotes.
Da, 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 da.
A very quick cavalcade.
Yes.
You've already mentioned this one, but I'm going to read it again just because it's so good. On the bottom of 53 to the top of 54, indentured labor can be measured in units of time just as well as commodity-producing labor can, but every serf knows that he expends a certain quantity of his own personal labor power in the service of his lord. The tithe the priest receives is easier to see than the blessing he offers. Banger quote.
Hell yeah.
I have another on page 55. Marx brings up Christianity And to set it up, he says, Christianity, with its cult of the abstract human being, which is especially pronounced in its bourgeois state of development,
Yes.
Protestantism, deism, and so on. He continues, but they are based either on the immaturity of the individual person who hasn't yet ripped himself free of the umbilical cord of his natural species connection with fellow humans, or on a direct relationship of domination and servitude. And I very much agree. I think the notion of dominion and service and the cult of power and personality that comes with organized religion are toxically intertwined.
I mean, not to mention the development of Protestantism and capitalism, man.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never read Max Weber, but that's the whole fucking book, ain't it? Yeah, I love that quote. Fucking Protestants, man. When you said they are based, I was really trying not to laugh there. Yeah, the only one I have really is this. This is on page 65. The fact that money is a commodity is news only to those who start with its finished form and begin to analyze it there. That's all.
Okay, so, well, what questions remain to you 2 chapters into Capital? What questions are lingering?
Not easy to formulate as a question, but I think my biggest question is really what's going to come next. How does this chain continue? How is this going to spin out into something that is then reflective of our society? That's my main question here, really. We're kind of locked in at this point, so it's just a matter of keeping it going.
Yeah, I would agree. I have, I guess, call it an academic question around scarcity that I've already expressed that is still lingering in my mind that I hope that he addresses to my satisfaction as we advance further in the text. And then, as you alluded to at the start of this episode, zooming out a little bit, I have always been resistant to reading Capital, not in any reason because I thought it was inscrutable or something like that necessarily, but because my previous thought was like, why? Who cares?
What's the point? Yeah.
Yeah, the economic side of communism is the least interesting and relevant part in my view.
Mm-hmm.
So why do I need to understand it more fully? And I guess there is still a part of me, even though I feel I've reconciled why it's necessary to read, the question of how it will be relevant to our revolutionary politic is still a lingering one.
Yes. That's a question that is going to be on my mind throughout this whole book. I'm really trying my hardest not to let it influence my reading is the only thing.
In a negative way, you mean?
Yeah, I don't want to be dissatisfied with this just because it doesn't give me revolutionary steps. I already know that that's not what I'm going to get from this, but your question is still super interesting to me because it is really true, right? I mean, once we see the full outlines of this system in the way that Marx wants us to, how will that change my revolutionary attitude?
Yeah.
That might be the better way I phrase it. So,
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. What are we reading next, Aaron?
Next up, we are going to read Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis.
The Y stands for yes, you should join us. Next time on Left Unread. Don't get left unread, baby.
Bye.
See ya.